is one of the hardest things to give, but it's the most freeing thing we can receive. And I've struggled with forgiveness and still struggle with it. And I think that this is something we should talk about more and really be a receptive vessel of what this can do to transform our life. And when we think about it, you know, people hurt us all the time. And letting go of past pain, sometimes we live in a perpetual unforgiveness spirit because we're still holding on to things that have happened to us in the past. And we say out of our mouth that we forgive someone, but then in our heart, we know that that unforgiveness is still there on the inside of us. And sometimes it's even a matter of us forgiving ourselves for things that we may have done. And when we realize that forgiveness isn't about them, it's really about us. And today I want to talk about the power of forgiveness and how it can transform our faith and how we have to grab hold of this even as a daily surrender. Because every day there are going to be things that are going to offend us. People are going to do things to us, and then we're even going to be hard on ourselves about things. And we have to grab hold of this because this is so important. And this is the central, I think, essential heartbeat to our walk with God. And this is how we experience peace, freedom, and growth spiritually when we really understand the importance of forgiveness. And when we look at this and lay a foundation, forgiveness reflects God's grace. And if we look at Ephesians chapter 4, verse 32, it says, "And be kind to one another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, even as God in Christ forgave us." So when we forgive others, it mirrors the forgiveness that we receive through Christ. And that grace that we receive on a day-to-day basis seems like the most difficult thing for us to do for others. We're so quick to cut someone off. We're so quick to operate in, I'm not going to forgive them. They've done this horrible thing to me. How could they? But we have to think about all of the things we do on a day-to-day basis, that when we come with a repentant heart, that the Lord forgives us and we receive forgiveness through Christ. And it's such a loving and sacrificial thing. And when we forgive, we extend grace that really represents God's heart and character. So what we want to really look at is we want to ask God to reveal who we need to forgive. We may need to write a list of names down and pray about that and really start to allow God to work on your heart to forgive those that may have hurt you. And this is so important. And this is something, like I mentioned, I deal with this and I have to constantly remind myself that God's grace is active in my life. And I have to be sure that I'm continually demonstrating the same grace that He's afforded me to others, no matter how hard it is. Because like I mentioned, it's not about them, it's about us receiving that peace and that freedom and that growth that we need to really fully operate in what God has purposed us to do. So when we think about forgiveness, it breaks the chains of bitterness. So if we look at Hebrews chapter 12, verses 14 through 15, it says, "Pursue peace with all people and holiness, without which no one will see the Lord, looking carefully lest anyone fall short of the grace of God. Let any root of bitterness springing up cause trouble." So when we hold on to unforgiveness, it creates bitterness and damages our heart and our relationships. Have you ever recalled a time where there had been so much resentment and bitterness built up because of something that someone did to you, and how horrible it makes you feel and how you look at that person? And it's so hard to look at someone with love when we have resentment and bitterness built up on the inside of us. So when we let go of that, it brings healing and it restores peace. Now, sometimes that forgiveness doesn't necessarily mean that we need to reconcile with this specific person, but knowing how to love that person through God's love allows us to be receiving the peace and the healing that we need so that we can move forward. Because that very thing that we may be asking God for, that very thing that we may want, may be tied up in that forgiveness that we need to offer and that grace that we need to offer to someone else. So when we have feelings of bitterness that are rising up, we can ask the Lord to release the pain that we are feeling about whatever the circumstance is. And you want to ask Him to help you let go of the bitterness and have the peace that you need to move forward. And when we look at forgiveness, it really opens up the door to healing. So we look at Psalms 147, verse 3. It says, He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. So forgiveness doesn't erase the pain, but it allows God to begin the healing process in our life. Because if we continue to hold on and we're not surrendering it to Him, we're allowing the anger to build up, and it blocks God from bringing healing to our life. And I found that, in the things that I experienced in my life, I was so angry and upset. And it was really causing me to continue to ruminate on these things when I should have been looking to God to help me get through it. But now that I'm, being able to see what forgiveness looks like, how I need to operate under God's grace and offer that grace to others, I feel like these burdens are being lifted. And when we are very intentional about this, God restores our relationship when we operate in forgiveness. It reconciles us back with God as well, because when we are walking in forgiveness, it restores our relationship with God. And if we look at Matthew chapter 6, verses 14 through 15, it says, For if you forgive men their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive men their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. So this is an act of obedience. Forgiveness is an act of obedience because it specifically says this, and it's going to strengthen our relationship with God. And refusing to forgive will hinder our ability to receive God's forgiveness. And the word says it right here. And I think we often forget about that because we want to receive things from God. We want to operate in the fullness of what God has for us. But sometimes that hindrance can be forgiveness. And you want to tell the Lord that I want to honor you by forgiving as you've forgiven me. And when we do this, we honor God. And you want to ask Him to help you take this step of obedience. Because remember, obedience leads to provision. And if we're harboring unforgiveness in our heart, we're being disobedient to His word. And it will hinder the things that He has for us. So when we think about forgiveness, it also frees us for spiritual growth. This is definitely growing pains. Forgiveness has been growing pains for me for a long time. And when you are a child and you're growing, and I don't know if you remember, I don't remember, but I can remember sometimes my kids saying my arms hurt, my legs hurt sometimes. And, I just thought that would probably be growing pains. And when we're growing and things are happening and we're transforming, it doesn't feel good. And when we're growing spiritually, forgiveness is one of those ways to open the door for spiritual growth. So if we look at Mark chapter 11, verse number 25, it says, And whenever you stand praying, if you have anything against anyone, forgive him, that your Father in heaven may also forgive you your trespasses. So unforgiveness can keep you stagnant. It can keep you in a place that you're asking God for certain things in your life, but then you have this unforgiveness in your heart and it's preventing you from moving forward. But when we forgive, it sets us free and allows us to grow in our faith. And it opens our heart to a greater intimacy with God. And all of us want to have that deep intimacy with God. We don't want anything hindering that. So having that growth and that clarity to allow us to really walk fully in what God has for us. So during your prayer time, you've already established who the list of people it is that you need to forgive. And you want to ask God to reveal to you what may be holding you back. Now, sometimes we may think that we are operating in forgiveness and we may not be. And this is why asking the Lord to reveal this to us so that we can experience that growth and allow Him to tell us what steps we need to take. So when we are embracing this, Matthew 11:28 says, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Forgiveness is a total act of surrender. And we want to lay down that heavy burden of resentment and anger because it can be so dangerous, because it then doesn't allow us to see people through love. It allows us to look at them in a way that we despise them. And although this person may have done horrible things to you and it may take time for you to get to this place, but it's a daily surrender, laying down that heavy burden, because we can't do it on our own. There is no way that we can look at someone through love without having God lead us and guide us through that. That is virtually impossible. So the only way that we'll be able to truly experience that forgiveness is to lay that burden down at His feet and allow Him to transform our heart so that even whatever that person has done to us, we can look at them through God's eyes with the love of God in our heart for that particular person. And when we have that surrender, Jesus invites us to release the weight of unforgiveness and find rest in Him. And that's the only way that this burden is going to be lifted. And I just wanted to just have this conversation. And I think it's so important because as we move on in life, and there are so many things that we want from God, and there can be things that are hindering us. And I think unforgiveness is one of those things at the top of the list that could be stopping us from receiving what God has for us because of what we're harboring and holding on to and not surrendering to Him. So I want you to take a step this week in forgiving those that you've placed on your list. And when we think about forgiveness, and as I go through what I talked about, it reflects God's grace. It breaks the chain of bitterness. It opens the door to healing. It restores our relationship with God, and it frees us for spiritual growth. So if there's someone that you need, or some people that you need to forgive, surrender it to God. Give it to Him. Do the physical act of writing those things down and allowing God to transform your life in ways that you've never experienced before. Because this very well could be the hindrance that's preventing you from hearing from Him and seeing the wonderful things that He has for you. So I wanted to have this conversation because I found myself falling into unforgiveness about a specific thing that was going on in my life. And I started to think about that over and over again and found myself getting angry and having bitterness and resentment rise up. And I felt it was necessary to record this because I know a lot of us may be experiencing this. And I wanted to share these scriptures and share this transformational information that can help free us from things that may be hindering us for what God has for us. So I hope this encourages you, and share this with someone who may be dealing with this, someone you may have had a conversation with regarding unforgiveness, and hopefully that this will free them from the burden of carrying unforgiveness in their heart. And always remember, you are an equipped woman living purposed, productive, and prosperous.